Hey, it's Jeff Zito, and thanks for listening to another episode of the Celebrity Jobber Podcast. Streaming on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Please subscribe. Would love a 5-star rating and leave a review. Check out past guests and episodes up on celebrityjobber.com. And please follow on Instagram, celebrity_jobber_podcast, or the YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/the@celebrityjobber. You know, if some of these celebrities didn't get their big break and become famous, they might hold a regular, ordinary job. My guest today is a legendary sports journalist turned author. He achieved national recognition as a sports journalist early on in his writing career. He has written sports columns and non-sports columns for the Detroit Free Press for a lot of years, and he also had a national sports talk show on ESPN. Did he always want to be a journalist? Was there another direction he wanted to pursue earlier in life? What was his big break and his very first job? We're about to find out. Legendary sports journalist and author Mitch Albom is my guest this week on Celebrity Jobber.
The Celebrity Jobber Podcast with Jeff Zito. If you like what you hear, please subscribe, give a 5-star rating, and leave a review. Check out all our past episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you pod. What if these celebrities weren't famous? What would they have become? What was their first job? We're about to find out.
Good morning, Mitch.
Morning.
I'm such a big fan of yours, and really excited to talk to you today, man.
Me too.
So, Mitch, I would imagine you were probably watching the Lions game last week. So, Dan Campbell no stranger to calling his own plays, but he hasn't in quite some time. And looks like he took that duty away from offensive coordinator John Morton. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that whole situation.
Well, yeah, no. I mean, when the head coach takes over the offensive play calling, there's a reason for it. And I thought he was very smart to do it. And I have great respect for Dan Campbell. I know him well, obviously. I go to all the games here and everything. And I think the way that he did it by just coming out and doing it, he didn't make announcements in the middle of the week. He didn't embarrass his assistant coach. He just took over.
Right.
And if nobody had asked him about it, he wouldn't have said anything about it. But it was a dead giveaway when he was wearing glasses on the sideline because he doesn't wear glasses, but he had to read his plays. But it obviously, look, it made a huge difference in the game, but it also, we need to note that playing against Washington is not playing against Minnesota, which was the week before when they did poorly. Washington has a terrible defense, and they lost a bunch of guys in the game as it was to temper tantrums and injuries. And so, they racked up an incredible amount of 540 whatever yards and all that. And I'm sure he'll continue to call the plays next week against the Eagles and other weeks. But fans should be careful not to expect that kind of amazing result against every team they play.
No doubt about it. Mitch, can you tell me a little bit about when you were younger? And I know when you went to college, your initial major when you first went to college with sociology. What were you planning on doing with that degree?
Well, my initial major was actually music when I first showed up, and then I met Maury Schwartz, who became the Maury of Tuesdays with Maury, and he taught sociology, and I liked him so much, and I ended up taking so many of his classes that I had enough credits to major in sociology. I didn't plan on doing anything with it. I just majored in Maury, basically. Right. And then I figured when I graduated, I would become a musician, which is exactly what happened.
So were you thinking about being a rock star or, at an early age? Was music your first passion, your first love when you were younger? And
yeah.
Then, okay.
And yeah. Music was my first love, and I played it all through high school and all through college. I didn't want to be a rock star as much as I wanted to be like a songwriter and a producer. I liked the studio. I performed obviously on stage. You always do as a musician. But the thrill to me was when I was in the studio and I got to play with the buttons and bring up different instruments and things like that. I could have done that the rest of my life.
Now, you grew up in New Jersey. Can you tell me a little bit about what your parents did for work?
My dad was in middle management contracts, and my mom was an interior designer. And we grew up just outside of Philadelphia.
The Celebrity Jobber Podcast with Jeff Zito. Celebrity Jobber.
When did you fall in love with journalism? Was there a particular moment in time where you knew that's what you wanted to do?
It was kind of an accident. I was a musician in New York, and I'd been doing it for a couple of years and really wasn't succeeding, and worked at night, because I was always playing gigs in clubs and things like that at night, and so I had my days free, and I happened to be in a supermarket, and they had a newspaper that they gave away for free that I picked up, and it said, if you have spare time, we could use some help putting out the newspaper. And so I went down and volunteered, and they gave me an assignment that night. I walked in and they said, okay, here, go out and do this. And I'd never written anything, and I didn't know anything about journalism, but I read newspapers, and obviously I guess I had some ability to write. And I went out and I wrote a story about what they sent me out on. It was parking meters, about raising the rates for parking meters. And the next week in the paper, there was my story with my name on it. And I got a little tingle inside and said, wow, I wrote something, I created it, there it is. And I started doing it more and more and more, and started working at that place 30, 40, 50 hours a week for free as a volunteer. But I learned journalism there over the course of the next year or so. And then I applied to graduate school and ended up becoming a journalist.
And then what was the moment, Mitch, where everything changed for you in your career? Was there a particular job or a big break maybe that you feel like if you didn't?
No, it was the opposite of a big break. It was a break from. I was doing very well as a sports writer. I was on ESPN all the time. I did a radio show. I wrote 5-6 columns a week, and then I happened to see the Nightline program and saw that an old college professor of mine, Maurice Schwartz, was dying from Lou Gehrig's disease. And he was talking to Ted Koppel about what it was like. And I had lost touch with him since I had graduated. He and I had been very close in school. And I went to go see him once, and once turned to twice, and twice turned to every Tuesday that he had left. And I ended up writing a book about the experience to help him pay his medical bills. And that's all it was supposed to be. It was called Tuesdays with Maury, but it ended up becoming something much, much bigger than I ever could have anticipated, and went from a 20,000 copy run, and they thought that that's all that they would ever print or anyone would ever read, to now it's the biggest selling memoir in history. And that certainly changed my life because, instead of sports, now people wanted to talk to me about people that they lost, and death and mourning and disease and the meaning of life and family and forgiveness and those kinds of things. And all my books ever since have been about those topics. So that happened when I was 37, and that was probably the real bend in my bifurcated life.
The Celebrity Jobber Podcast with Jeff Zito. The Celebrity Jobber Podcast with Jeff Zito.
And mentioning that book, I mean, it's such an iconic book, and it's a memoir. It's but what gets me, what makes me anxious, is when I see people that are writing fiction. And I know that your new book right now, Twice, is fiction. This is not your first novel. You have plenty of other novels. But tell me, are these stories in your mind? And how do you? I mean, to me, it seems like such a daunting task to make up the story and then ask yourself if people are going to like it. Can you tell us a little bit about that process? Well,
I've been doing it for almost 30 years now, so it's not new to me, and I've written a bunch of novels, many of them, and it's different than writing nonfiction. Obviously, nonfiction, you got to rely on the facts and your reporting and interviews and things like that, but it's still storytelling. And even in nonfiction, you're telling a story. And you're not just printing facts up. You tell a narrative, and so in fiction, you can do the same thing. And in this case, this new book, Twice, is the story of a guy who finds out when he's a little boy that he has the magical ability to do everything in his life twice. But he has to live with the consequence of the second try. He can't go back to the first one if he doesn't like the way it worked out the second time. And he goes through his life kind of fixing his adolescent mistakes and, making the basketball shot that he missed or taking back the embarrassing comment he made in front of a teenage girl or something like that. And when he's a man, he discovers that there's one caveat to the power that he has. It doesn't work with love. If someone loves you and you decide you want to go back in time and try somebody else, and you give your heart to somebody else, and that first person can never love you again. They'll be in the world, you can talk to them, but there's no going back. And he, of course, at some point in the book, he's married and he thinks he's got the perfect person, and then he gets tempted and he has to make a very faithful choice. And again, I wrote this because, I see a lot of people in life talk about their regrets and talk about, if only I could do this over again. And I said, well, let's write a book about someone who has that power and see if his life is really any better than yours. And so that's how you mix sort of real life concerns that you would talk about maybe even in a nonfiction book. I could see a nonfiction book about regrets, but this is a novel about regrets. And so they're really not as far apart as you might think.
Mitch, is there one moment in your life that you would want to change? Is there, was there secretly some sort of inspiration on one thing that happened to you that you wish you had a do-over?
Well, there are many. I mean, there are many things I wish I could correct and mistakes I wish I could correct. But if you told me that by correcting them, I would have to lose the scars that I suffered from having made them or lose the lessons that I learned from those scars, then I would probably say no thank you, because that's how I've evolved, and that's how I've grown and become a person who doesn't make those mistakes again. So, the answer is yes and no because of that.
Celebrity Jobber. The Celebrity Jobber Podcast with Jeff Zito.
What about your very first job ever? I want to know, what was the very first thing you got paid to do?
Oh, that's easy. I was 11 years old. My father told me, that's it, you have to pull your own weight. I didn't even know what that meant. And so I got a job at Veterans Stadium in Philadelphia selling programs and scorecards and yearbooks to the Phillies games, the Philadelphia Phillies baseball. And I would show up 3 hours before the game, and they would give me a sweaty shirt that someone else had worn the day before, and you had to put it on over your shirt, so it was red and white striped. And then they give you a big bag of programs and yearbooks and pens, and they send you out. And when you come back with the money, if they're walking up and down the stadium steps over and over again, you give them the money for how many you bought, and they give you, 5% of what it is in cash, and then they give you more scorecards and yearbooks, and you go back out and you sell them again. And I would walk around the stadium for 3 hours yelling in my high-pitched little voice, scorecards, lineup, that kind of thing. and that was my first job.
Wow. Is it true what they say about Philly fans? They're the toughest fans in America?
You don't want to mess around with Philly fans. No, they're awful. I mean, and I know because I grew up there. Yeah, they boo Santa Claus. They, throw snowballs at people. They're tough, but I get it. They're passionate and they're tough, and I grew up in it, so I guess I have to take responsibility for it. But I was on the other end, and as a kid who sold programs, I remember that, when the gates would open, there would only be, a handful of people would trickle in before a game, and we all raced over to try to sell them programs because I wasn't the only one. There were dozens of people with these, and there'd be some guy like way up in the center field seats, way up, and he'd be waving at you, and you'd go running around sweating, and running up the steps trying to, then you get all the way up to the top step, and he'd go, "Send the hot dog guy up." That's a Philly fan for you.
Oh, man. Well, I got to tell you, Mitch, again, I'm a big admirer of yours, and I appreciate your time. The book, by the way, New York Times bestseller, nothing new to this guy, and Twice is his current novel, available everywhere. And I was just thinking, if I could go back in time and change something in my past, I would. It would have something to do with my ex-wife. But you said it didn't work in love, right? Right, Mitch?
That's right. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I don't think I.
You have to read the book to understand the rules. But I'm sure you learned something from that experience with your ex-wife that informed you in your relationships going forward. So think of it that way.
I guess so. Mitch Albom, Twice, New York Times bestseller, over 42 million copies sold. Thank you so much. Real pleasure.
Pleasure. Thank you.
You know, a very, very successful guy in the world of, sports journalism. He has written for the Detroit Free Press for so many years. Still to this day, he does that. Sports and a non-sports column as well. And he also did sports radio shows. So, between writing and doing the radio shows, I could only imagine how hectic a schedule he had. So when I asked what his big break was, I would have expected him to tell me getting that job at the Detroit Free Press or, starting his radio show on ESPN. But no, it was the book Tuesdays with Maury. He was 37 years old, and that gave him a break from the hustle and bustle of his everyday life, which I definitely understand. Being in the journalism business, media business, radio business, it is a grind. And to do that newspaper and radio show, I can only imagine what his day looked like. But the break came from the book. And he told the story about he saw the news piece with Ted Koppel on his old college professor who really meant a lot to him. And he ended up meeting with him, Maury Schwartz. And one Tuesday turned into 2 Tuesdays, which turned into 3, 4. And his objective was to help this guy pay for his medical bills. So that's why he wrote this book. And as he said, it turned into something way more than that. The greatest selling memoir in history. So I guess that break gave him the ability to stop the hustle and bustle of his everyday life with the newspaper and radio, and more or less kind of transitioned into becoming a full-time author. And originally in college, he was a music major, so he wanted to be a musician. He grew up in a middle-class family just outside of Philly in New Jersey. And his first job, I thought it was a great story. His dad told him he needed to pull his own weight. He didn't even know what that meant. But he got a job at the old Veterans Stadium, the Vet, at Philadelphia Philly baseball games, selling programs. And he was just a little kid. And he also backs up the fact that Philadelphia sports fans are mean. Meanest sports fans in America. Probably a reason that I hear they have a jail in the stadium. So anyway, his latest book is titled Twice. Author, journalist, radio host, Mitch Albom. Who knows? He might have been a musician or a producer. You never know what path life ultimately takes you on. So thank you once again for listening to another episode of the Celebrity Jobber Podcast. And if you want to check out past guests and episodes, you can do so online at celebrityjobber.com. Everyone's got a story, and we'll have a new one for you coming up next week. Until then, I'm Jeff Zito.